the gentleman inspired. The gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Plaskett. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Asian hate and violence skyrocketed as some racists blamed a virus coming out of China on all Asian Americans. Since March of 2020, Stop AAPI Hate, a nonprofit organization aimed at tracking and addressing anti-Asian hate, reported more than 11,000 anti-Asian acts of hate and violence. This same report found that 49% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced some form of discrimination. These acts of hate include Asian Americans being beaten, spit on, screamed at, and even killed. And the increases in these types of attacks during COVID accompanied a slew of anti-Chinese sentiments related to the virus, like calling it the quote-unquote China virus and even disgustingly quote-unquote Kung flu. Many Asian Americans were harassed, physically accosted, and told that they quote-unquote created the virus. Yet one of our Republican witnesses encourages this appalling rhetoric and promotes anti-Asian hate with dangerous and unfounded claims. Just last week, Mr. Kennedy suggested COVID-19 was a bioweapon and said it was, quote, targeted to attack Caucasians and Black people, end quote, and that, quote, the people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese, end quote, suggesting that the Chinese people didn't suffer like others during the pandemic. Despite asserting that he should become their president, Mr. Kennedy seems to disregard the correlation between anti-Asian rhetoric and violence. Ms. Wiley, do you frequently work with minority communities, including Chinese American or other Asian American communities?
I do.
And do you think Mr. Kennedy's theory is racist?
I think that Mr. Kennedy's statements fuels the theories that suggest that there's a biology to race and that therefore we can actually identify people in communities as possibly either being benefited by or being people who are not sharing the same interests and needs as the rest of us. And yes, that has served to drive hate and bias, and sadly, including violent incidents.
Now, it was said earlier in this hearing that Mr. Kennedy is a smart man. Now, so far as I know, he does not have any specific education or training in medicine. He is not an epidemiologist, one who studies infectious diseases. He has never conducted clinical trials in a professional setting. He has never done scientific research in a professional laboratory and published scientific findings in a peer-reviewed publication. Ms. Wiley, what kind of harm does someone with absolutely no medical training or knowledge do when they espouse unfounded anti-Asian vaccine theories during a fraught time like COVID?
One of the things that happened in this historic pandemic was that there was certainly a need to get on top of very quickly what the science said. I am not a scientist either. And so what social media platforms did was go and speak to government agencies because their own policies, their own user agreements required them to look at and figure out what the facts were so that they could assess what was responsible and what was not responsible to post. I say that because it was incredibly important to ensure that people were getting real-time information as possible, but also ones that really demonstrated what all of us need, rather than where and how we should ascribe blame or where and how we should consider who benefits and who doesn't, because we were all harmed. But I say this in part because it was the social media platforms themselves that reached out to government agencies, including Health and Human Services and CDC, to get that information. And under the vacated opinion, it's really important to understand, it has been vacated by the Fifth Circuit, this preliminary injunction on all these incidents we're talking about, because one of the things it would do, in my view, just as in my legal view, is that it was actually saying that the government could not respond to such requests under this injunction, which is incredibly overbroad, dangerous, and doesn't allow government agencies to do what they are chartered to do.
Now, I'm an attorney by training, and one of the things I learned very early on in constitutional law is that no right given to the people of the United States is absolute, and that includes the right to free speech, because you do not have the right to shout fire in a crowded theater because it could produce harm and death of people by being false. These social media platforms have user policies to try to prevent that kind of harm. Is that not correct, Ms. Wiley?
That is correct.
And so we are not trying to censor speech. We are simply trying to create factually correct information to prevent harm to people, including death. And that's what they were trying to do during COVID. Is that not correct?
Legally speaking, absolutely. And I say that as a matter of law, which is that court cases say that the government has in fact, it's its role to ask for compliance with policies. The policies on the books of social media platforms were violated. And they
Excuse
said
me,
those,
Mr. Chairman, but the last questioner got an additional extra minute. I'm at 35 seconds over. I would just
Point of order,
ask that
Mr.
she
Chairman.
be
The
able to
Democrat
finish-
beforehand got an extra
finish
minute.
her sentence.
Trying to be generous.
Finish her
Trying to be
sentence.
generous, even when the response is that the government determines the truth.
I
I'm trying
would
to be
like for her
generous.
to be able to finish her sentence, Mr. Chairman, then I will yield back.
Okay, Ms. Wiley, you can finish your sentence.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I remember the sentence, but
Okay.
thank you.
Okay.
I just think the
I
point
do.
was, it was.
I do. You were saying
there's
the
a
government
record-
should be the arbiter
Can
of
you
what's
please
truth.
not put
That's
words into
actually-
the mouth of the witness and let her respond?
The chair
It's
now
her
recognizes the
answer.
gentlelady from New York, the gentlelady from California.
I love how you follow the rules,
The time
Mr.
is-
Chairman.
the
It's
time is-
really indicative of
time
what a
is,
kangaroo court